During election years, federal employees always have to be a little bit more aware of the Hatch Act. You know, no politics or politicking while on the job. This year, there's more than usual reason to pay attention to the Hatch Act rules. The Office of Special Counsel has come out with a bunch of new compliance updates ahead of the presidential election this fall. Here with the details, Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. And there's a lot of changes they've put out here. One has to do with White House officials. I think they're working on the record of the last few terms here. What will that change do, Drew?
That's right, Tom. That is one of the more notable changes, I would say, from OSC. And in practice, the change will mean that White House staff who are in violation of the Hatch Act will be deferred to the Merit Systems Protection Board rather than directly to the president. That's the same standard that most career federal employees are already held to. So the idea here and what OSC is saying is that essentially it's going to bridge or make equal those two different groups, White House senior staffers and just any federal employee. So most Senate confirmed officials are exempt from the enforcement from MSPB, but White House staffers are not, and those changes aim to just align the two.
Have there been some recent violations from senior White House officials, Hatch Act violations?
Yes, for sure. I think that is one of the reasons that OSC has decided to issue this new advisory opinion and make some of the changes that they did. Back during the Trump administration, there were reports that at least 13 White House officials were found in violation of the Hatch Act, but they didn't receive any repercussions for their actions. More recently, during the Biden administration, you also had former White House Chief of Staff Ron Klain, who violated the Hatch Act by retweeting a political group's post on his official Twitter account. So even something like that can be a violation of the Hatch Act. There's a lot of little detailed things and nuances, but in all of those cases, OSC didn't pursue any disciplinary action of those violations. So I think that is part of the reason why you're seeing this kind of harder line or harder stance against White House officials from OSC now.
All right. And there's some other changes, too, that OSC came out with. Tell us more about those.
So one of them talks specifically about former federal employees. So generally, OSC has only been looking into cases for active federal employees, but now people who used to work for the government don't anymore, but maybe they committed a Hatch Act violation or were alleged to be committing a violation when they were a government employee. Now they can be charged as well. A lot of those repercussions that federal employees face are they could potentially be fired. You can get a grade reduction. You can also pay up to $1,000 in a fine. And now those same, I think that's one of the questions that's coming up is how would those apply to former federal employees? Of course, you can have the fine come up, but I think what it's going to mean is that they wouldn't be able to, if they, for example, wanted to go back into government work, wouldn't be able to for the foreseeable future.
Wow, so some pretty tough stuff there, yes. And the OSC has something to say about political candidate memorabilia, MAGA hats and Biden bonnets, that kind of thing?
That's right. So there are already rules about different political parties or displaying a party memorabilia at the office. And that includes, of course, not just in the office, but teleworking or working from home. If you can see something in the back of your meeting screen, that counts as well. But now OSC is changing the rules for specifically political candidates, not just political parties. And they're essentially just making the rules even or equal or the same between those different factors. So now, basically, the change is that there's a year-round prohibition on political candidate displays, not just before Election Day, but also just year-round. So just making it more equal.
And probably, maybe in the back of their mind, there is the idea that this election and the last one are about as divisive as we've seen, in this century anyway, or since the Civil War. And just having that kind of activity can just simply ruin the comity, you might say, in a workplace.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that OSC pointed out in their advisory opinion was that political candidates are becoming much more aligned with political parties now. And I think that was one of the reasons that they mentioned for the change. Another little interesting tidbit that was brought up was, does this apply only to current political candidates? Or, for example, could you have a mug of Ronald Reagan sitting on your desk or something like that? But OSC, in their advisory opinion, says specifically it's meant for current or contemporary political candidates. So that's just one little nuance for employees to pay attention to as well.
And we should also point out it's not just workplace rules. The Hatch Act bars federal employees from running for partisan office. You can maybe run for the proverbial dog catcher race that's not partisan.
That's correct. There's a lot of different little nuances or pieces of the Hatch Act that federal employees should be paying attention to. OSC, the Office of Special Counsel, lists out all of this very helpfully on their website. They have resources. It's called the Do's and Don'ts of the Hatch Act. They specify between those who are less restricted and those who are more restricted. There's two categories of federal employees. Most fall under the less restricted category, but you just want to make sure to check that resource and check up before Election Day. But I think a lot of those changes are coming because of this timing here.
And you can do things politically, but you just can't do them in connection with your identity as a Fed. You can't say, hey, I'm from the EPA and I'm in favor of such and such, even if it's after hours.
Right. Yeah. It's only if you're acting in your official capacity or if you're on the clock at work, that's where the restrictions apply. But if you're just acting as a citizen and not as someone in official capacity, then of course you can participate in those events.
Just don't mention your official capacity, because that kind of
That's
puts
right.
an imprimatur on it, sure. And these changes are coming exactly now because of the election?
That seems to be a big reason why. And, just with the relatively new special counsel at OSC, I think everyone who comes in issues their own reinterpretation of what the Hatch Act is and some of the other things that OSC does. So this is really a reinterpretation on looking at the same language that's been around from the Hatch Act for quite some time now. The law was passed, I believe, in 1939. So just a couple little tweaks here and there ahead of election season.
All right. A new deal for the New Deal era law. Federal News Network's Drew Friedman, thanks so much.
Thank you.
And check out her story at federalnewsnetwork.com.